Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. Third of 8 live streams today, if all the tech and the guests turn up and I don't have to go and do something. But it's all great. We're excited to be here. So we hinted at the role of the Navy and how the Navy's role is way more than just ferrying people across in landing craft for June the 6th. It begins earlier, ends later. And we finally have a dedicated book looking at the wider battle of the naval actions across around the channel and around the invasion site, and Nick Hewitt wrote it, and he is here to talk about it now, so I'll bring him in now. Good morning, Nick. How are you today?
Good morning. I'm great, thanks, Paul. Good to see you.
So how have you been commemorating D-Day? Have you got media work? Are you watching on TV? What are you up to?
Doing this and lots of podcasting, because I live in Orkney now, so so I'm a long way from where it all happened, but I'm not a long way from where it started, because all the bombardment ships for the British side, a lot of them came from up here. So we tend to think of it as all starting on the south coast of England, but actually it's all around the British coast. So we've got our own little D-Day connection, but I'm certainly a long way from Normandy.
That was very slick, the way you just brought in it all starting near where you live. But you've got a little bit of a PowerPoint. And folks, we're going to start today with kind of a 15-20 minute presentation from Nick, and then we'll open up to questions about, perhaps are the Navy overlooked? What's the part that we do focus on? What should we be focusing on? What are the myths? We'll deal with that later. I'm going to hand it to Nick now. And again, folks, thank you for being with us, because you have multiple choices of where to be today to coverage D-Day, and those of you who are here are choosing to watch me, which is fantastic. And Nick. So, Nick, over to you.
Thanks very much. Good to see you, everybody. Yeah, so the naval side of D-Day has really been a bit of a golden thread running through my career since I worked on board HMS Belfast when I was a baby historian back in the early 2000s. But every time I got to this story, it just got bigger and bigger. Belfast had a very specific role. She was a big gun cruiser. She spent her time on the Normandy gun line, supporting the army, bombarding shore targets. But thousands of other sailors made Neptune happen. They crewed landing ships, they crewed tiny assault craft and wallowing motorized barges. They spotted for the big guns, they swept mines, they protected the flanks of the invasion from attack. They sank block ships under fire, they helped to build the Mulberry Harbour. And later on, they repaired devastated French ports. Ashore, they planned, organised and delivered the entire thing, from drafty offices and underground bunkers. And yet, the more I read, the more I realised that these sailors were largely absent from the literature, particularly from more recent publications. Even though Neptune Overlord is widely recognised as the greatest, most complex amphibious operation in history, and amphibious operations depend on ships and sailors. That most readers will find one or two. They're usually operating landing craft, and they're usually on the 6th of June 1944. They are passive facilitators. So the premise of my book is a simple one, that in the summer of 1944, sailors fought a long, exhausting and dangerous battle at sea, which mirrored the Battle of Normandy on land, one which I've called the Battle of the Seine Bay. Defeat in the Seine Bay might have been unlikely, but even a significant setback could have stalled the land battle and prolonged the war for months. Much early Normandy writing played down any sense of risk associated with the naval campaign. And so it brought to pass Admiral Bertram Ramsay's worst fear, which you can see in the quote on the slide here, that it was all easy and plain sailing. Nothing could be more wrong. It was excellent planning and execution. So the huge, complex Battle of the Seine Bay got compressed into one day of tension and a long exercise in logistics, with sailors as taxi drivers and freight haulers, and most writers metaphorically rushing ashore with the soldiers as fast as they could without looking back. Nothing could be further from the truth. Almost every day, before, during, and after D-Day, Allied sailors put their lives on the line, and ships were lost or damaged, protecting those long, fragile supply lines. And my book is an attempt to rebalance this by writing a naval history of the campaign. I really only look at events on land occasionally, just for context and orientation. My source material is primarily a mix of official documents from the UK National Archives. There's so much untapped material there, and various museum collections, supported by memoirs and personal testimony from the IWM Sound Archive and the BBC People's War Archive, and then some selected secondary works. Let's see if the tech works now. Yes, it does. There we go. So the first third of the book looks at events which preceded D-Day. After a bit of a preamble, I've really started my story with the Quebec Conference in August 1943, because that's when they made the final decision to carry out the assault landing in Normandy. They stopped arguing about the Pas-de-Calais and all these other locations, and also they were going to do a simultaneous landing in southern France. The great thing about when you're kind of trying to create a sense of a campaign that hasn't really been looked at before, there are other moments where you could start it. That just happens to be where I've put my pin in. I then go on to look at operations in the Channel from sort of January 43 until June 44, which made the waters in and around the Seine Bay a safe operating environment. Now, it's important to point out, not every one, in fact, very few of these operations were conceived deliberately as enabling operations for Neptune. And most of the sailors involved had no idea that there was any connection, but indirectly, they almost all helped. So by the time Neptune takes place, the Allied navies have really established a kind of qualitative and quantitative dominance over the Kriegsmarine in the necessary waters. I then go on to look at planning. Ramsay gets appointed Allied Naval Commander Expeditionary Force on the 25th of October 1943. This is before Eisenhower, before Montgomery, which gives you some idea of the complexities that everybody knew would be associated with the naval ops. Yes, Norma, yes, he does. Admiral Ramsay, my vote too. Needs to be a statue in Portsmouth.
He went to my school, or I went to his school.
Oh, there you go.
We weren't in the same class, I hasten to add. He was a couple of years ahead of me.
You're wearing very well, Paul. You're very, very well. Eisenhower and Montgomery then threw him a challenge, a huge curveball, actually, because as we all know, I've gone one over. They expanded the landings to 5 divisions from 3. That's pretty easy if you're a soldier. We'll throw another division at it. If you're the sailor trying to get all the necessary shipping to put those soldiers in, it's an absolute nightmare. Ramsay takes it on the chin. Eventually, the problem is solved by firstly requesting US help. Previously, the British had said they would do Neptune entirely on their own, but once it's a 5-division landing, it's outside the capability of the Royal Navy to do. They defer the landings from May to June to get another month's worth of landing craft production. And crucially and politically controversially, they defer the southern France landing to allow assault shipping to be transferred from the Mediterranean. So eventually you get an armada that is more than 7,000 ships and craft strong, depending on what you count, including 1,213 warships. Can you imagine that? 1,213 warships. I suspect that's bigger than all of Western Europe's navies now.
And I know you said we're doing a presentation, British. I know we said we were going to let you talk, but just one of the things that comes up a lot is the comparison of scales, because there's various parameters you can use to compare the size of operations. So some people say, no, Husky is bigger than Overlord, and some people say, no, the Okinawa is bigger than Overlord or bigger than Husky. But it's depending on how you... So how do you define biggest in this sense or of size comparison?
It's what you count. Husky puts more troops ashore, bizarrely, because they're they're putting bigger ships in dangerous places a lot earlier on. Neptune has more ships. I'm not an expert in the Pacific side of things, so I don't really have enough knowledge around Okinawa to say with any certainty. But I do know that you've got entire carrier battle groups operating with the US Navy Pacific Fleet. The Pacific is a very different ball game in terms of what you put in. You've got no land-based air cover in the Pacific, clearly. So everything has to come off carriers. But also the enemy can't reinforce by land. So, the risks are, once you've sealed off an island, you can pretty much do what you like. So there's a lot of differences between the way it's done in the Pacific. But I would consider, from the naval perspective, Neptune is the biggest because the fleet is vast and never really gets surpassed.
Thank you.
There was still, though, never enough landing craft. And actually, you'll see there on the right this amazing picture that actually my friend and colleague Steve Fisher found, which is our own Portsmouth-based LCT 7074 being constructed up in the northeast of England. The Neptune Joint Plan, so this is the naval plan, that gets issued on the 28th of February, a staggering 1,000 pages of orders for every commanding officer. The main tasks are pretty simple in theory. One is to break the crust of the German defences and land the assault formations. And 2 is continue without delay the supply and reinforcement of the army. Obviously, it's the execution that makes that complicated. All of this has been informed by an extraordinarily detailed intelligence picture, which sailors are intimately involved in. And again, I go on to talk about that in the book. Intelligence is derived from ultra decrypts, from human intelligence like the French resistance, aerial recon, but also covert beach surveys carried out by these amazing groups, combinations of sailors and Royal Engineers, the Combined Operations Pilotage Parties, or COPs. So what they had to do was creep onto beaches along the entire European coastline, because obviously you can't just focus on Normandy, otherwise you'll give away your landing zone, to measure the beach gradients and check the consistency of sand and shingle and bring back samples. And just generally the amount of effort that went into compiling this intelligence picture is extraordinary. All of those ships needed sailors to man them. So by 43, 44, you're really seeing Neptune hoovering up almost each intake of British naval recruits. Most of them are going into combined operations to train as landing craft crews. Training is incredibly hard. So what you see is sailors really doing something that's much more like commando training. They spend more time running over hills in battle dress than they do afloat. They then, if they pass, go on to learn how to operate landing craft. Then they join their units and practice as formations. And then they take part in these huge pre-assault rehearsals. Perhaps the best known is Exercise Tiger, the final rehearsal for Force U, which was famously attacked by German E-boats, the Allied nickname for the Kriegsmarine Schnellbooten, basically fast motor torpedo boats, on the night of the 27th, 28th of April. 3 precious tank landing ships are lost, and 749 US servicemen are killed. And that's a clear illustration for the Allies that the Kriegsmarine is not a busted flush at this point. The Germans are still a clear and present danger in the Seine Bay. We then go on, this middle part of the book really deals with the invasion itself, so the embarkation, the crossing, the assault landings, and the first follow-up waves. Neptune actually officially began at 23:30 on the 25th of May, when naval commanders opened Ramsay's orders and military camps on the south coast of England were sealed. It takes days to embark the Armada. You then have, after an unseasonal summer gale, which we all know about, that causes a 24-hour delay, they finally set off on the night of the 5th, 6th of June. A little nod to the minesweepers. I talk quite a lot about sweeping. Sweeping and marking this huge stretch of sea was fraught with danger. The minesweepers are the first to go. Neptune is history's biggest minesweeping operation. There are so many superlatives with Neptune, and this is another one of them, involving at least 250 sweepers. The British Naval Staff history says 250. Other sources say more. And it went on until the end of the campaign. Excuse me 1 second. I'm just going to have to blow my nose.
No problem at all. And folks, while Nick's talking, the links to Nick's book are in the description below, as always, or you can find it at your favorite bookstore.
The next thing you get is the bombardment. The bombardment plan is phenomenally complex. 8 targets are allocated to each ship. Heavy ships like HMS Belfast or the battleships concentrate on big German coastal batteries that can hit the fleet at sea. Smaller ships focus on pillboxes and beachfront defences. And then you get a final phase, which is this drenching fire phase, where smaller warships and armed landing craft move close inshore with the idea of just suppressing the defenders during those really vulnerable minutes as the landing craft are approaching the beaches. And actually, one of the things I've discovered is that's one of the things that the destroyers from the home fleet that were based up here in Orkney, they practiced that, bombarding the hell out of a beautiful little island called Papa Westry that we have up here. And if you go to Pappy now and wander around the north end of the island, it's covered in shell craters and you can still pull splinters out of the ground. Sailors spotted for the big guns. They were ashore operating with the army. They were above in modified Spitfire and Seafire fighters. None of the beaches were easy for sailors, although so often their contribution is minimised. There's really no time to do all the detail here, but to give just one example, when we look at Omaha and the whole, much debate on Twitter at the moment about Saving Private Ryan and all that stuff, I don't get irritated by the absence of British soldiers in Saving Private Ryan. It's an American story about an American beach. I do get irritated by the absence of American sailors, because American destroyers and a couple of British ships actually are instrumental in breaking that deadlock in Omaha. They take their ships on their own initiative, really close inshore, firing in direct support of the troops, often being directed by soldiers ashore. And that helps them break the deadlock and helps them get inland. So Captain Miller would not have got the draws without a US destroyer giving him gunfire support.
Mm.
General Bradley recognised this after the war, writing that the Navy saved our hides. As well as dozens of landing craft, 2 destroyers were lost on the 6th of June, the Norwegian Seine to an attack by German torpedo boats in the east. That one's in all the books. Nobody ever talks about the USS Corrie, which was hit by a German shore battery to the west in Utah area and is also sunk. Next to shore, you get the follow-up waves. Everybody forgets them. LCT 7074 is part of that. So Force L in the British Eastern Task Force, Force B in the US, they are assault loaded in landing craft and they're coming in what are still very dangerous areas in many cases. And then go on to look at logistics. I've only actually got Neptune plan. The Neptune plan aimed to land on average 1 1/3 Army divisions per day after the initial assault. So that's, divisions about 10 to 15,000 men, depending on whose army it is. 1 1/3 of those, that required an average of 8 merchant convoys a day and a 24-hour cycle of landing craft convoys. The landing craft are just going backwards and forwards the whole time. And actually every landing craft that's lost on the 6th is 1 ferry craft lost to the follow-up, which is a real crucial point. I only put a single chapter of the book into logistics because a narrative of every convoy would get a bit repetitive, but it's a really important one. And I do make the point repeatedly that these daily passages made by landing craft crews and merchant mariners working round the clock to bring the army what it needed continued to be the end of the Battle of the Seine Bay and well beyond. And it was exhausting, back-breaking work. And there's an official report that I quoted there where the operators of the ferry craft and the landing craft in particular are nearly broken after about a month of it. Once the convoys had arrived off the assault areas, the challenge then was to get the reinforcements and the supplies they carried ashore. So the landing craft and landing ships could simply beach. There's a bit of a debate over the LSTs, the famous landing ships tank. Initially, they don't want to beach them. That's the plan. They're worried that their backs will break. So they concoct this convoluted plan to offload them into rhino ferries. And you can see one in the bottom left here, basically motorized rafts. But that takes so long. By D+1, Admiral Ramsey says you must beach the LSTs, and their backs don't break, and they're absolutely fine. So the bigger merchant ships, though, they have no real option other than to discharge into ferry craft. So as well as rhinos, there are recycled assault landing craft for the landings, converted Thames barges, all sorts of things, ducks, famously the amphibious trucks. To protect the shipping from the weather, gooseberry breakwaters are made by scuttling old ships off all the assault areas. A lot of people don't realise that. There's a gooseberry off every beach. And then later you get the 2 famous Mulberry artificial harbours, each one the size of Dover, built to accommodate the bigger ships and allow them to discharge straight onto the shore. The American ones at Saint Laurent in Omaha sector and Arromanches for the British. All of this needs organising, and sailors are at the heart of that. So you've got Royal Navy Beach Commandos. You can see one on the bottom right here, part of the tri-service beach groups, and they are basically traffic cops. They have the job of getting every new arrival off the beach as quickly and efficiently as possible. You get similar teams operating in the US sector. The logistics of Neptune spawned an extraordinary set of acronyms. You get BUCO, the Build-Up Control Organization, which basically matched shipping to military priorities. You get TURCO, or Turnaround Control, which is trying to move shipping around as efficiently as possible. And COREP, the Control Repair Organization, which organized those broken hulls to be patched up and put back into service as quickly as possible. There's 2 incredibly overworked naval officers who I feature in the book, the Captain Northbound Sailings and Captain Southbound Sailings. Their identities change as they get changed in postings. And they are traffic cops at sea. They're directing the shipping to their destinations. They're basically pushing the ships onto the right bit of beach and then sending empty hulls home as quickly as possible. One of them paints the upper works of his ship pink because he is just so concerned that they're not going to spot him and they're not going to get the right directions. So really interesting stuff. Between the 18th and the 21st of June, you get the worst summer storm in living memory passes through this channel, which provides a graphic illustration of just how easily things could have gone wrong if Ramsey hadn't planned it and executed it perfectly. The wind speeds reached force 7. That's about 56 kilometers an hour. Waves topped around 2.5 meters. The storm smashed the US Mulberry completely, damaged the British one, wrecked about 800 ferry craft, drove most of them ashore, and virtually stopped any discharge of supplies, men or vehicles for 36 hours. And certainly my military opposite numbers will confirm that storm and that impact pretty much slows down or even stops operations on land. So it's a sign really of, if the Germans had been able to interfere, and if the Allied navies hadn't done their job properly, it would have been relatively easy to have turned the pipeline off, and things would have slowed down pretty rapidly. Thanks to another largely unrecognised group of sailors, the salvage teams, 600 of those hulls had been refloated by the 8th of July. They actually took a fleet of 55 salvage vessels for operations in the Seine Bay. They had lifting lighters, wreck dispersal vessels, and rescue and salvage tugs, and 2 fully equipped repair ships. The final third of the book is devoted to a really key point, that the sea battle did not end on D-Day. That vital flow of supplies was under constant attack, and the range of threats was really considerable. When we think about the Luftwaffe in Normandy, we tend to think of it through, again, that soldier's perspective, that they've been shot out of the sky and they're just not there. And we think of Pips Perilla flying up the beach on the 6th of June, and that's about it. That's not where the problem is. The problem is at night. There are Luftwaffe night intruder raids almost every night through the period that I'm writing about. They're dropping mines, they're carrying out torpedo attacks, they're carrying out bombing raids. Night is a great leveler. All those lovely Allied day fighters, they can't fly at night, so they're reliant on a much smaller number of night fighters, mostly Mosquitoes, being controlled by fighter direction tenders. So these are specially modified ships. And then the anti-aircraft fire from the fleet, which is a bit of a two-edged sword, because sailors, I'm afraid, tend to shoot at anything that flies. There's fire from German heavy coastal guns pretty consistently on the British eastern flank, and eventually Sword Beach is shut down as an area for discharging supplies because the gunfire is so intense. Further out, U-boats never stop trying to break through to the convoys. Mines are probably the most serious challenge faced by the fleet, the Germans concentrating on the US area initially and then moving the main weight of their mine laying over to the British flank after D+1. By the 25th of June, 25 ships had been sunk or damaged by mines in the British area, and by the 21st, 10 warships and 24 other craft in the US sector. Rigorous sweeping took care of the more conventional mines, 261 being swept in the US sector and 291 in the British by 3rd of July. I've actually got a map in the book that shows every single mine swept in the assault area through the period of Operation Neptune. It's pretty staggering. But by far the greatest threat was posed by a new type, nicknamed oysters. So these responded to the change in water pressure caused by a passing ship, and they were virtually unsweepable. To deal with all of this, the Allies have a pre-planned, complex, interlocking defence line to protect the bay. Further out at sea, you've got anti-submarine groups and aggressive cruiser and destroyer sweeps. Closer inshore, you've got patrols and anchored lines of minesweepers, coastal forces craft, and armed landing craft on the flanks of the assault area. These were famously nicknamed the Trout Line in the British sector. On the 25th of June, an Anglo-American task force goes in again to support the US Army in its assault on Cherbourg. This time, the Germans were alerted and opposition was extremely tough, and all but one of the 7 heavy ships involved were hit, along with 3 destroyers. On the 3rd of July, Operation Neptune ends. This means absolutely nothing to the fleet afloat. So again, we tend to think, 3rd of July, it's all over for the sailors. It really isn't. All that is a command change. So the assault force commanders are redeployed, but the ships are still there and they're still working hard. In fact, you get a new threat from July, from the 5th. The Kriegsmarine deploys what they call their Kleinkampfverbände, or small battle units. So these are human torpedoes, explosive motorboats, midget submarines, all manner of nasties, operating from a small town called Villers-sur-Mer, which is near Le Havre in the British sector. When the US Army broke out of the beachhead in Operation Cobra on the 23rd of July, again, is that it? Is it all over for the sailors? It really isn't. The naval war changed, but it didn't end. In the west, the Allied navies start to range right along the French coast, attacking German evacuation convoys and driving the last remnants of the Kriegsmarine back into port. The fleet diminishes. A lot of the American ships leave at this point, either for home or for the Mediterranean to support the southern France landings. But the eastern flank remained dangerous because the Germans held out in Le Havre until the 12th of September. And actually, that's the date that I've chosen to end the Battle of the Seine Bay. Just to reflect very briefly as I end, 917 ships and smaller craft were lost or damaged during Operation Neptune, either due to weather or enemy action, including 26 warships of various sizes lost to all causes and another 84 damaged. There's no real definitive casualty list because the campaign's not been studied, but I've estimated just under 3,000 sailors lost carrying out operations in or near the Seine Bay. That's by using the Commonwealth War Graves Commission and various other US and British sources. There's no doubt, considering the sheer size of the fleet, the losses were relatively low and certainly acceptable by the grim logic which applies in wartime. But this isn't the point. The point is it was not easy if you were involved, either in a position of authority trying to run it all, or at the sharp end on a ship in the Seine Bay. Every time a ship set off a mine or was torpedoed, most sailors would have wondered if they were next. So I'm sure it certainly felt like a battle to them. Thank you very much.
Well, brilliant stuff, Nick. And obviously, we need to read the book for the full story. It goes without saying, folks. I won't plug it too much, but yeah, you've got to go and read the book for full details. But we've got a few questions building up, and I've got things I want to ask you as well, so we'll deal with them. So this is an interesting one from Errol over in New Zealand. The planning was amazing. Fewer late changes than the airborne, I assume. So you talked about the Neptune plan kind of being handed over January, February, and then it goes on, as you say, till July. But as James Daly is going to be talking about when he comes on sometime later, that there's all these airborne ops planned after D-Day, and even before D-Day, the plans are changing and information is being updated about German troop movements. The naval plan, does it stay fairly rigid, or is it constantly being amended in this sort of the April-May period?
It's a really interesting question. There's a little bit of tension, a little bit of Anglo-American tension over the planning. So Ramsay's obviously built up this tremendous body of experience in the Mediterranean. He's Cunningham's deputy for Torch. He's a task force commander for Husky. Thanks very much, Gary. That's really kind. Ramsay believes that actually with 7,000 ships sculling around in a fairly congested body of water, you need to plan every movement to the minutest detail, and that's what he does. That's not how the Americans operate. So when the Americans get involved, Admiral Kirk, who is the US Western Task Force commander, he's pretty unhappy about this. And I've read a lovely transcript of an interview with him 10 years later. He's still seething about it because US naval doctrine delegates an awful lot more authority to individual commanders. They can use their initiative. So I think had it been done using US doctrine, you probably would have seen those changes. But Ramsay is pretty much, this is how it's going to be. The biggest point of tension is after that attack on Exercise Tiger, when Kirk tries to push through, and I've got quite a lot of documentary evidence on this, and it's really interesting because Kirk tries to insist that the German E-boat bases are saturation bombed by Bomber Command and the US 8th Air Force in advance of the landings because he's so concerned about the E-boat threat. And Ramsay rightly puts him back in his box and says, you can't do this because it will absolutely give away where we're going to land. He's very diplomatic in his correspondence, which is really interesting. If you read the published version of his diary, he's very, very scathing about Kirk and a number of his subordinates, actually. So there are attempts to change it, but actually Ramsay pretty much goes with this is the plan and this is what we're sticking to. The only caveat to that is obviously the biggest change is the one he has to make when Eisenhower and Montgomery are appointed and the whole thing expands to 5 divisions. But he hasn't really written a plan by that point. But that does change all the preliminary thinking. It tears up any work that was done as part of Cossack. So there's still a huge amount of work to be done in a very short space of time.
No, thank you. And thank you for dealing with the sniffles and stuff. And Phil Budd is paying you a compliment about his granddad's job in the Belfast. And then your response to that first question dovetails nicely to the second question. And Ian Carr is asking about how different would the narrative have been if Ramsay had survived the war and produced an autobiography? Because a lot of our thinking about the campaign, broad, naval, airborne, whatever, is told through these big players. Eisenhower wrote about it, Bradley, Montgomery, Ramsay. You would suggest more important than any of those guys, even almost put together, doesn't survive. Obviously, there's the archives you were using of what was happening back and forth in headquarters. But yeah, what's your thing? Do you think what difference might he have made?
Absolutely, that question nails it. And if Ian hadn't asked it, I would have raised it. Ramsay doesn't write a memoir. Ramsay dies in an air crash in January 1945, and he loses the battle of the memoirs.
Yeah.
And I think he is more important, because the others couldn't have done their job if Ramsay hadn't got them there. And Ramsay gets them there in exemplary style. But you're right, Montgomery is always a fabulous self-promoter, and I'm not qualified to argue about Montgomery one way or the other, but he's definitely interested in bigging up his own participation. Of course he is. Eisenhower's trying to be president, so he's doing very much the same. So if you read their memoirs, whilst they both kind of nod to the naval contribution, and actually Montgomery's quite uncharacteristically generous about it, and I do quote him in the book, they're not telling the naval story. And so from the very, very earliest stages, the story is told through the eyes of soldiers. And although there are two fairly kind of well-known books that come out about Operation Neptune in the early post-war period, I guess you've got Edwards is probably the best of them. They're quite dry and quite clinical. They're also before the intelligence. A lot of the information about Ultra and the intelligence picture is classified at that point. A lot of the information about the deception operations is classified at that point. And also there is a definite, and I'm still trying to put a finger on why, those two early books, there's a definite incentive to play down risk and peril. And now I don't know whether that's because they're naval officers, and I think there's probably an incentive to not discourage anyone from doing anything like this again. So not try and show that it was too dangerous. I think there's a phenomenal amount of hindsight involved in the way we look at Neptune. We do think it was easy because it worked. It was never easy. It was really hard work, and there was a huge amount of risk involved in it. So as a consequence, by the time you get to the kind of the later writers, I won't name names, but the sort of those who are appearing in the 70s and 80s, they're drawing on that story, and they are basically drawing the conclusion that there's really nothing to say about sailors. And then it all becomes enshrined then. So, yeah, if Ramsay had written a really good memoir, he might, of course, have written a memoir like Viands, which is pretty dull and very short. But if he'd written a good memoir, and his diaries seem to indicate he would have written a good memoir, it could have changed everything.
Thank you. Great response. And, as someone living in Normandy from the battlefield guiding world, it's hard to explain the Navy's role, because do you point at the sea and say, well, over there was this and over there was that? You haven't got your features. You haven't got, if you're explaining a land battle, that's the hill, that's the crest, that's the bridge, that's the choke point. It's Vince O'Hara who writes about the Navy. He was taken over to Casablanca to talk about the Battle of Casablanca through a hotel window, looking at the sea. He did it.
Bring me over, Paul, and we'll do a battlefield tour that's naval thing, because it's very doable. You just need to.
Well, we'll do that. We'll do that. But that idea of the naval aspect being underwritten about, because it is, as you explain, there's a hell of a lot of organization of the different speeds and sizes of ships and the roles they're performing, and the keeping it all in what is, even today, the Channel was the busiest waterway in the world or something, and back then it would have just been insanely busy that day, and just that management of that. But management isn't sexy in the way that Stan Hollis Victoria Cross knocking out machine gun nests is. A sort of very tangible aspect of understandable bravery.
But E-boats hitting the flank every night, and intruder raids coming in, and all that stuff is sexy, actually.
It is. No, you're right. You're right. And that's why people should read your book. But you mentioned deception in your response to about Ramsay. You're preempting the next question like a good. There's a naval planner in you somewhere, Nick. So Gary is saying, was there any need for deception regarding naval ops? So we have the whole Operation Fortitude to try and persuade the Germans, the Allies, landing something else. Is there anything particular to the naval aspect that is deceptive?
Yeah, and I do cover this in the book. There's a couple of operations called. I mean, everything falls under the Fortitude umbrella. There are sailors involved in Fortitude. There are naval dummy broadcast units who I talk about in the book, and actually on the night of D-Day itself, you get a couple of operations called Taxable and Glimmer, which are basically, one is a huge decoy sortie towards the Pas de Calais, which is coastal forces craft, and actually 617 Squadron, the dambusters, scattering vast quantities of window to simulate an invasion fleet at sea. And then there are coastal forces craft literally broadcasting the sounds of a fleet from open water. And there's a similar operation to the west. So yes, sailors are intimately involved in the deception ops.
Okay. Well, we'll try and rattle through a few more questions. So this should be a quick one. Trevor is saying, who were the crews on the block ships? Merchant Navy, I guess.
No, they're Royal Navy, Royal Navy and Royal Engineers, because there's some really weird stuff about the demarcation lines around all these, Mulberry Harbour and the block ships generally. The Army are responsible for one particular bit of it, and the Navy are responsible for the other. The block ships are taken over by naval crews, and then Royal Engineers blow out the bottoms of the ships.
Thank you. Perfect answer. Nice and swift as well. This should be a fairly quick one from Ian Carr. How long before D-Day had naval targets been allocated to ships for planning and locating? And Stephen Fisher would remind us that they didn't pre-bombard Hillman, which is one of his bugbears with that aspect. But yeah, when did the targets get allocated?
So most of it, the Neptune bombardment plan is another vast document. And again, I've got some fabulous files from the TNA that show just the length of detail they went to allocate targets. Most of it's done by the time they issue the Neptune Joint Plan in the end of February. There are some, as the intelligence picture changes, they do adapt. It's a phenomenally good intelligence picture. It's not perfect. So Steve Fisher obviously has mentioned Hillman. There's some very well known, the fact that the guns in the Merville battery were the wrong caliber, and the ones at Point de Hoc weren't in the casemates and all that kind of thing. So not everything is 100% perfect, but they have pretty much done a good job on identifying the principal threats, because coastal batteries are hard to find. So most of it's done by the 28th of Feb, but there are amends. If you read the accounts of the commanding officers, that they get the orders and then they get all the amends. There's a fabulous description from Roger Hill's book, Destroyer Captain, and he describes that the file of amends that they have to match up to the orders is almost as big as the original orders. And in theory, he's not supposed to open them yet, and he's supposed to do all this on his own. Now, because Hill's a really experienced officer at this point, he basically goes, solve that for a game of soldiers, and he opens them early. And he gets a bottle of gin out and he brings all his officers into the wardroom, and they do it collectively. Otherwise, they'd never have got the job done. So they are making changes up to the last minute. But most of it's done by the time the joint plan is issued. This
is potentially a longer one to answer. And I'll put my answer in first, then I'll let you do yours. So Neil came on and said about the Mulberry Harbours. How crucial to D-Day in the Battle of Normandy were they? I've heard more supplies were delivered to Omaha and Utah, etc., after Mulberry A was abandoned. So my response is yes, there were a lot of supplies coming ashore in Utah and Omaha. But for me, and I'll see if your answer tallies with mine, the Mulberries are an insurance policy. They are the what if the weather goes shit again? That's something, because the beach landings, as successful as they were after the terrible storm you mentioned, July and August were pretty okay out in the channel, broadly speaking. And so landings could carry on and unloading. But if there had been another set of storms, because that storm delayed the ground advance, the repercussions of a sort of 3-day halt to things, were a week or 2 weeks. So they may not have been used quite as their sole use didn't become a factor. But for me, they are the insurance policy you need. What's your answer?
So I take this on the chin in the book, actually. There are 3 mechanisms for getting supplies ashore. One is over the beaches, one is the mulberries, and the third one that's always forgotten is the little ports that they capture in the invasion. They're all important and they all serve a purpose. Neil is absolutely right. The Americans get more supplies over the beaches at Omaha. Their rate of discharge in Omaha is phenomenal. But Mulberry B also exceeds all its targets and is phenomenally successful. I think they're 3 legs of a stool, and you don't want to take any of them away. The beaches, but by the real testament and tribute, I think, to the Mulberry is that it's still being used well after the period that I'm writing about, actually. It's only supposed to last the summer. The damn thing goes on all the way through the autumn and into the winter, and it only really becomes less important because the fighting has moved so far away from Normandy, and they've got Antwerp. It doesn't stop functioning because it's no good anymore. So it's a huge success story. I think it's one of those things where, because they did use them all, we don't know what the impact would have been if the
Mm.
Mulberry Harbour had been taken out of the picture. But personally, I think all of those 3 routes in are really, really important, and they all make a huge contribution. And I think it's a bit of a futile argument trying to argue about which one was the most important. And what they all do is allow them to not rely on the capture of a large port, which Dieppe had told them was going to be completely unattainable. And actually, even when they do it and they take Cherbourg, Cherbourg has been so comprehensively trashed by the Germans that it's weeks before they can use it. So I think they're all important. Is the short
Okay, thank you.
answer.
I will add that your response to my own response for a lot more lengthy response when I get asked the question. So we've got a couple more just quick ones, and then we'll see how much more time we've got before I bring Giles Milton on. But Trevor is saying, did any ships used on D-Day then sail to the Med for Operation Dragoon? So I'm assuming US definitely. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely right, and some of the British ships as well. So, the ships that have been brought from the Mediterranean get returned. The bombarding warships, all the Americans really go round for Dragoon. Some of the British ships do, and a lot of the assault shipping does.
Okay, thank you. That was a quick one there. Scott Grimwood, does your book include activities of Allied MTBs?
100%. Yeah, that's it. All the activity on the flanks, guarding the flanks. Lots of stuff about coastal forces. I think you'll really like it if you like MTBs.
Brilliant. And this one I hope isn't too complicated and lengthy from Gary there. Do you know anything about Royal Navy Commander Hughes Hallett's played in the artificial harbour concept, and if his original concept, what would have been like had it been turned out to be something or more limited or otherwise different? So, yeah.
That's a great question. I mean, I do talk about Hughes Hallett in the book, and it's not a book about Mulberry, but I do look at the origins of Mulberry. It's probably a bit complex to get into today. There were multiple versions of Mulberry that were experimented with. Hughes Hallett's original concept isn't much on the detail, but then they start to look at 3 completely different routes towards creating an artificial harbour. Hughes Hallett really just says we should take a harbour with us. Yeah. So I do look at very, very briefly at those 3 different options and why they go for the version that they eventually took.
Brilliant. One more from Rob Crane, then I'm going to ask one. How much training did the Royal Navy landing craft crews get to do with American forces that they landed? And I know Giles is going to be talking about Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Green in his presentation next. So, we have the fact there are Americans on Gold and there are Brits on Omaha and et cetera, et cetera. So we talk a lot about the complexities of tank and infantry coordination in land, but this is basically this wider picture of people coming in with the Royal Navy doctrine and their landing craft and how they do things work with American forces. How much training was there, and was it always slick, the cooperation?
So if I could just take that one, there's quite a lot to say about this one, so I'll get as quick as I can. The bulk of the landing craft crews are still British, Royal Navy. Yep. And Canadian. There are Americans there, but most of them are Brits. The Brits who are working with the Americans get as much time as the Brits who are working with Brits, and that time is basically those large scale assault rehearsals. So once they've finished their flotilla training, they then join their formations, and then they start to work with the military units that they're landing. And so if they are Brits working with Americans, that's when they start working with the American assault troops that they're landing with. There is that kind of doctrinal issue that is always quite challenging. I think one of the really kind of rabbit holes that's just so utterly pointless about Neptune, Overlord, Normandy is that kind of Americans versus British thing, which is so futile because it was an allied operation. The reason why the Brits in the first place say we'll do Neptune is because the Americans, the US Navy, is so thoroughly overcommitted to the Pacific, and that's, they haven't got the resources. The really interesting thing is there is a doctrinal split between the US Army and the US Navy. Now, the way the US divide up their global responsibilities is the European theatre of operations is Army-led, and the Pacific is Navy-led. The US Army has learned all its amphibious warfare doctrine working with the Brits in the Mediterranean. So they're doing it, they're very much trained the British way. So the US Army doesn't have any problem working with the British Army because they've been doing it, all the way, with the Royal Navy, rather, all the way through the Mediterranean. The US Navy that arrives as a kind of late commitment and are not used to doing it this way, there is a certain amount of tension, but it's a tension with their own soldiers as much as it is with the British. So it's really interesting. But in terms of Jimmy Green, I cover Jimmy Green in the book. He's a remarkable human being. He's training with Taylor Fellows and the Bedford Boys, well in advance for the assault rehearsals.
He was
I quote him actually being shelled by, I think he gets shelled by the USS Texas by mistake during a training exercise, which disconcerts him a little bit.
He had the most piercing blue eyes. And I met him a few times. His son is still kind of a buddy of mine, and we would meet often on Omaha Beach, and he would just make eye contact with you with his eyes. It was you couldn't look away. He was incredibly well thought out, and his answers were very considered and measured, and of this general idea that it was an Allied effort. He never liked to be separated as the Brit on Omaha and the Americans there. He was like, no, we're all Omaha veterans. We're all part of Operation Neptune. He was a very wise man. And I mean, my last story before we will have to bring things to end is it's a slightly lighter one, Nick, what's the biggest myth around D-Day or Normandy from the naval point of view that you just that boils your boils your as we say, what is here we go again.
My whole book really is a way of busting what the biggest myth that really boils my piss is that it was all over for the sailors on the 6th of June, that they drove landing craft and then they went home, and it's so untrue. It just makes steam come out of my ears.
It is that the overarching theme of the fact that people think it sort of all begins just when fleet sets off on the morning of June the 6th. Like everyone's literally been twiddling their thumbs for months on end, and it's it's this wider, deeper, complex understanding that it's kind of the end of one chapter for the Navy and the commencement of a new one. Then for the ground forces, it's the beginning of a completely new chapter. And when the chapter breaks occur, as you said earlier, isn't consistent across the services, so to speak, in that the push of the Allies into Brittany then opens up the Germans doing with the U-boat pens and the troops, the Navy presence down there. Does that kickstarts another naval chapter? That's this. Dates are very, very useful for us to kind of hang on to, but they're very rarely are they as precise and this starts on that day.
Exactly that. It's all a bit arbitrary, and that leads to really quite grotesque oversimplification sometimes, I think.
Well, what we'll do is we'll invite you back in the future to hone in on one of these aspects. We're not History Rage. That's another podcast, a very good podcast, folks.
I'm doing them too.
Doing them too, and I can't. In that case, I'll listen to that and listen to you rage. But we'll perhaps bring you back and do a deeper dive on one of these aspects. Andrew Whitmarsh is coming back to talk about the landing craft on D-Day, for example. So maybe we can come back and you can talk. For me, it's the LCTs are the unsung. We talk about the Higgins boats, but the LCTs are the central, most important aspect to me from as a student, most of the ground warfare. But Nick, I haven't actually got a copy of your book yet. I don't know why. I was hoping to get. Are you going to be? We have ways, aren't you?
I'm not. We have ways. No.
Well, I'll have to just get one from you somehow because you sent.
I'll send you one, Paul. That's no problem.
We'll get that sorted out. But Nick, it's been a delight talking to you. You know what to do, folks. You all know, everybody watching this, that your naval aspect of D-Day is limited. You've all got more books. You don't need to tell me on the infantry and the airborne. You all know if there's one area you need more writing on, it's the naval aspect. So you know what to do, folks. Support me, support Nick. Go out there and buy that book. But folks, I'll be back in about 11 minutes' time with Giles Milton telling some of his favorite stories of D-Day. Thank you, Nick. Enjoy the rest of your D-Day. Get over the sniffles, and I will speak to you again. Cheers. Bye.
Thanks, Paul. Good to speak to you.